Well, good morning, friends. I am Pastor Michelle, and I'm wearing my fun Christmas outfit as I do the sermon this morning. I wanted to show you too. Look, it lights up. Okay, it doesn't light up as much as I wish it would, but today I wanted to offer up my my sermon from today. Today is the second Sunday of Advent, December 7th, and my sermon today is all about John the Baptist and Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West, from the musical and movie Wicked. So I'm excited to preach this. So I want to go ahead and get started. And the passage that I use from John the Baptist is when he is talking about preparing the way for Jesus, a voice crying out in the wilderness. I chose not to include other scriptures from John the Baptist's story, including his birth story. Or the beheading of John the Baptist. I did not include those readings in the bulletin this week, only because that would have made the bulletin even longer, and would have given our liturgists even more to read. And it's Christmas season; it's the time to give. And I wanted to give shorter readings. So, my friends, here we go. Let's dive right in, should we? And my sermon title is "Seeing Things in a New Way." And what I love is that I was able to use. If you can see it, my bulletin cover is a picture of John the Baptist with Elphaba. So, all right. So, I think only at Harmony Creek Church, and perhaps just only from me, you're not your typical pastor, would you get a sermon on this second Sunday of Advent that is centered around John the Baptist and Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West, from the Broadway musical and movie Wicked. I wanted to offer up a different type of sermon this morning. Advent is the season of holy disruption. It's a season for prophets, rebels, and truth tellers. A season for the people who dare to say the world is not as it should be. But another way is coming. There is another way to see the world. Another way is possible. And I believe John the Baptist and Elphaba are both prophets in their own way. They're both rebels with a cause. So this morning we're going to explore together the lives of John the Baptist and Elphaba. And now, thinking about John the Baptist, New Testament scholar James F. McGrath talks in his book Christmaker. He talks about how John the Baptist wasn't just a warm-up act for Jesus. He was a movement leader. He was a visionary in his own right. He was a reformer whose courage shaped Jesus's own ministry. I like to correct my sermon as I preach it, so just bear with me. Thinking about John's birth story, which is definitely a unique one. A lot of birth stories in the Bible are very unique. But even around Advent, it's important to have a unique birth story because Advent begins with stories of startling, unlikely births, right? I mean, we'll have the ultimate birth story, right, as Jesus being born in a manger or wherever he was born. Now, speaking of John the Baptist birth story, scholar McGrath, he emphasizes that John's birth narrative echoes the birth stories of biblical heroes like Samuel and Samson. And as I've preached a few weeks back, Samson's not always known as the good guy in the story, but that was a sermon for another time. John was born into a tradition of world changers, and not world changers the easy way, but world changers the messy wilderness, prepare the way. He enters the world through a story that's wrapped in mystery and miracle, which a lot of birth stories are in the Bible. And his birth stories echo the story of Abraham and Sarah, who were well beyond the birthing years. And Abraham and Sarah still were able to have a child, right? Have the child of Isaac. But going back to John's story, his parents, Elizabeth and Zechariah, much like Abraham and Sarah, they had given up hope of having children. They were older, past the age where anyone would expect new life. Yet God interrupts their quiet, settled routine with a birth that changes history. John was a child born to parents who thought the story was over. He was a child who was announced by angels. He was a child who leapt in his mother's womb at the very presence of Jesus, who was still in his mother's womb. And I love that story. You know, that he leapt at the presence of Jesus before either John or Jesus had even been born. And John was also born into a priestly family. Zechariah was a priest. And according to scholars, the fact that John's dad was a priest would make John a priest as well. But John didn't want that life. He stepped outside of the religious establishment. He refused to be defined by the temple system his dad belonged to. Instead, John embraced something very different. John embraced the wilderness. He embraced simplicity. He embraced authenticity. And not because he was quirky. Perhaps he was, though, right? I mean, he was known for wearing camel's hair and eating locusts and wild honey. You know, he embraced the wilderness mostly because he believed that God was doing something radically different. Now, switching to Elphaba, who also has a unique birth story, one that doesn't take place in a temple. She arrives into the world under strange, surprising circumstances. For her, it wasn't easy being green. Reference to Kermit. She was born into a world that instantly judged her as wrong, as cursed, as other. I mean, even her own father didn't want anything to do with her. You know, the moment that she enters the world, she's marked not by miracle and joy. Perhaps that's how John was marked as he entered the world. But Elphaba was marked by suspicion and fear. From the moment she was born, she was excluded. She was among the outsiders. She was marginalized. Now, like John's birth story, Elphaba's story, I think, also disrupts expectations. Because her birth becomes the beginning of someone who will challenge the brokenness of the land of Oz. Elphaba, she grows up brilliant, passionate, and very aware of the injustice in Oz, long before I think anyone else wanted to name it. She challenges the great wizard that oversees Oz, this powerful figure that's at the center of the corrupt system in place, because she knows the illusion of goodness with him hides deeply rooted harm. She knows the truth about the wizard, that ultimately he was just some guy pulling big levers behind a big curtain. He really didn't have as much power as he thought he did. Now, both Elphaba and John the Baptist were considered threats, right? They were threats. And why? For the simple truth that they were truth tellers. And truth tellers are always seen as threats. There's that great quote, right? That the truth will set you free, but first is going to piss you off. And I think they made a lot of people mad, Elphaba and John the Baptist. Thinking about John the Baptist, you know, in his book, McGrath talks about the importance of the baptisms that John was offering in the river. And that is what he is most known for. You know, they weren't just symbolic. They weren't just moments for people to come in and get a little dip in the river. The protests that he was offering were the baptisms that John was offering were protests, were a form of protest. When John was dunking people in the river, it was like he was declaring that forgiveness and belonging were available outside the temple. God was available outside of the temple. Forgiveness was available outside the control of the religious hierarchy that was in place. It was a very radical and dangerous thing that John was doing, but he kept doing it. He kept dunking people and baptizing them. He even baptized Jesus. We don't hear much about John the Baptist after he baptizes Jesus, but I'm assuming he continued to baptize people long after Jesus was baptized. You know, John is preaching a radical message and telling the people around him that they don't have to go to the temple to receive forgiveness. They don't have to go and pay fines or pay dues at the temple. They don't have to go find a goat or a cow or whatever animal they need to find to sacrifice. They don't have to go to the temple for someone to tell them that they belong to God. John was inviting people to come to the river as they are. Forgiveness wasn't controlled by the powerful. It was, and it is freely offered by God. Of course, this would have been a threat to the religious leaders, a threat to anyone who benefits when people believe they are unworthy. People who benefit people who become powerful at the hands of the powerless. I'm going to write that one down. Thank you because this is my practice round before I preach for real. Okay, sorry. Thanks for bearing with me and being, yeah. Okay, it just takes me a minute. And, going back to Oz, our so-called wicked witch of the West was a lot like John the Baptist. She was not baptizing people and with water, right? She was not going into rivers. She had a complicated relationship with water, right? But Elphaba was bravely telling the truth and bravely challenging the corrupt systems in place in the land of Oz. She saw how Oz manipulates, lies, oppresses, and harms those who are different. And you know what? She refused to look away. She refused to play nice. She stood up to the powers that be, and it cost her everything. Everything. Now, thinking about, their deaths, their so-called deaths, McGrath points out that John is imprisoned and eventually executed, head on a plate and everything. He's killed because he challenged the powerful who were using their power not for good, but for bad. And the person who came after John also was killed because of the way he challenged the empire, the powers that be. Of course, I'm talking about Jesus, who came after. Elphaba, too, faced a dramatic and unjust ending when a girl named Dorothy and her little dog, too, they throw a bucket of water on Elphaba and supposedly melt the witch to death. And it's always, watching Wicked it helped me to see the story of Wizard of Oz in a new way, and isn't part of preparing the way for God about opening our eyes to see things in a new way. Here's the beautiful thing, because what happened was I started to see Dorothy in a new way. Dorothy wasn't just some innocent girl who had NEM and her house blew away in a tornado. Dorothy wasn't all innocent either. So anyway, that's a story for another day. But the beautiful thing about both their stories is that they don't end necessarily with destruction. They continue with transformation. John's work ripples forward into the ministry of Jesus. Elphaba's work reshapes the entire land of Oz and awakens new generations to choose truth over illusions. And perhaps the person most changed by Elphaba's courage was her best friend, Glinda. Glinda, who is known for being the good witch. My all-time favorite song from Wicked is the song For Good, which was sung in this new movie that came out recently, Wicked 2. And there's that line, which I love, because I knew you, I have been changed for good. Elphaba and Glinda sing this to each other, acknowledging that even the hard parts of their relationship, even the misunderstandings, even the conflict, all of it shaped them into the witches they were today. All of it. They were changed for good, each of them. And I like to think we could almost imagine Jesus and John serenading each other, singing this to each other as well. It's an interesting image. John was changed for good by Jesus, and Jesus was changed for good by John. And I love that. We may not hear a lot about how John changed Jesus, but I'd like to think they were both changed for good. And McGrath reminds us, as I've said already, that John was more than just Jesus's opening act. John wasn't just important because he's the one that prepared the way for Jesus. John was someone who changed history for good. I believe his courage shaped Jesus himself. We're reminded that Advent, the season of Advent, is a season where God uses the unexpected to bring about hope. where God shows up in the most unlikely places, right? You know, God showing up in the form of a baby. You know, it's hope doesn't wait for perfection. God doesn't wait for perfection to show up. God doesn't need everything to be normal. God arrives in strange places to strange people and often in strange colors, perhaps. And hope arrives in those things as well. You know, Advent is about the ways that God is not only changing the world around us, but Advent can be about the ways that God continues to show up in our lives, right? Through the Emmanuel, God with us. But Advent's also about the way that God is changing us too. Not for perfect, not for easy, not for perfection, but for good. Advent invites us to ask the question, who is changing us for good? How are we changing ourselves for good? How are we changing the world around us for good? The world needs people who speak truth even when it's unpopular and hard to hear. The world needs people who stand up for the vulnerable. The world needs churches who say we refuse to settle for the world as it is because God is preparing a way for the world as it should be. And friends, God is doing that through every single one of us. Friends, the world needs Harmony Creek Church. The world needs us. And so may we be like John, who was unapologetically bold. May we be like Elphaba, willing to defy gravity and expectations. And may our lives, may our courage, may our love change our community, change us, change the ones we love for good. Amen. So thank you, my friends, for bearing with me as I preach this sermon. So we'll see how it goes this morning in service. But thank you for being with me and listening to my sermon this morning. So much love to all of you. And thank you for being you. Let's continue to go out and prepare the way for the Lord. And we do that, right, by seeing things in a new way, by daring to allow ourselves to see the possibilities that different ways are possible. Much love to all of you.